this because it's important for us to kind of get the history straight. It's important for us to start to think about and to talk a little bit about Africa with respect to some of the things that we have learned about Africa and some of the things that we're learning now. We start to know, and that's being revealed in this century, in the 21st century, as we start to think about it. And it becomes really important to me to kind of just share some things. So as I come across things, I want to share it with you. And I also want to make sure that we are just getting the word out. So I wanted that whole concept of somebody giving Africa something. I've heard that so many times throughout my life, so many times throughout many of the things that I've dealt with and many of the things that I've seen and read about history or been taught. I've been taught so many times that, mathematics comes from someplace else, and, metallurgy and iron working, which is, seen by many historians and many archaeologists as being a very significant advance forward for human beings. And that, so many different things somehow magically, even though people started in Africa and came from Africa, so many different things supposedly started outside of Africa and then came back into Africa. And that's how African people got it. And we have to dispel that notion. There are people in Africa and all over the world who did many things, who discovered things on their own, and it wasn't just stuff that was brought to them. So I wanted to kind of jump into that and talk about that today as I start to jump in and have that perspective. And, as we've been talking, this is a timeline that I've been working on and dealing with, but we've been talking, but we know that Homo sapiens like you and I have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. So at the very least, 300,000 years. And when you think about that and you stop for a second and say, wait a minute, 300,000 years of human history. And it's probably longer than that, and even prior to, Homo sapiens, there are human ancestors that have various levels of the human ancestors and various things that are going on. You start to think of hundreds of thousands of years of activity, at least hundreds of thousands of years of activity. And somehow we are to believe that things happened, that nothing developed on the continent of Africa, that everything happened outside of Africa, and that the world didn't progress in a way where everybody contributed, and everybody, including Africa, contributed to the humanity and the experiences we're having today and the success in some reasons and into some of the things that are not so successful that we have today. And so we have this idea that somehow people went around for this long period of time in Africa before they left, right? And we know that Homo erectus left before that, but that they went and not much was done. And that's simply not true. One of the things that I propose as I look at it is that it wasn't simply just that things were happening, that in many cases you more than likely had situations where people were doing things and engaging in certain things and activities that were natural, activities that were based on the environment that they lived in. And after many, we already talk hundreds of thousands of years, after many thousands of years passed by, a lot of things, if you were dealing with mud brick or even some of the stone things you would use might not be around after 15, 20, 30, 40,000 years. Think about that. There are a lot of things that were going on. And I did a little video that talked about the Limbombo bone. And we also know about the Ashango artifact that's tens of thousands of years old that showed clear markings of some type of mathematical awareness and cognitive ability and being used for some reason. These are things that could have been used just in the environment and just washed away. Things that we don't find, things that are hidden. And when you want to find something, you got to look for it. And if you don't want to find something, you don't look for it. And then that's the case with a lot of things in Africa. And there are a lot of things that have been going on in Africa, archaeologically speaking, that we just have not looked for, right? So I wanted to share this right here because this was an article that was written in Nature, and I have the reference for it down below in the description. You can see it here, but I'll show it to you here so that you can see it and take a look at that, and we'll kind of jump into it a little bit. This is an article that was published last October in the journal Nature, so you can read it yourself. You can take a look at it, and it struck me as I was looking at it in terms of just looking at what it was talking about and the evidence that was supporting. So this is an article that talks about the earliest known wooden structure. So we start to think about Africans. You start to think about various things that happen in Africa. You start to notice that many things are taking place, and are taking place in a natural environment, and are taking place over a period of time and in an area where human beings and human ancestors have been for millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years, like we talked about. So this idea that nothing happened, like it just always bothered me as I read history and read about things, the idea that nothing happened of significance on Earth until about 2,000 years ago, maybe 3,000 years ago, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, if we go back far enough. But even if you go back 15,000 years, that nothing happened on Earth until that time, 4 or 5, whatever thousand years ago, seemed ridiculous to me. When you know that we had human beings, Homo sapiens, just like you and I, and our predecessors around for hundreds of thousands of years. Could it be that many things were done in history and they're just lost? Could it be that many things, structures were made societies developed, groupings took place, and they may have been small in nature. You're talking about the beginning of humankind. Could it be that these things took place and we just don't know them? That it's been that much time that's passed by that these structures or these societies or some of the things that they knew and even did has washed away. You have gone with history. You have biodegraded back into the earth. Has been grown over or covered with sand or covered with water, whatever it may be. The things that happen naturally over thousands and thousands of years. Could it be that human beings did a lot more than we give them credit for? And I think that's important for us to think about and to tell our children. And so as I look at this particular article, as I mentioned, that was published in Nature, last year, just in October, if you will, of 2023, it was published in October of 2023. As you take a look at that, and we dig into it, it was written by Barham L. as well as this group of archaeologists that did this study. And they're looking at what is they found to be the earliest structural use of wood, and that particular structural use of wood was some 476,000 years ago. And you can see it in this article as they talk about that they found many things, many different types of uses for wood and aspects with wood and shapings and carvings and use of wood that was much older than expected. So you can see that this particular piece of wood that we're going to talk about today and the structure that they're going to talk about was in the Colombo Falls in Zambia. So this is in southern Africa, right there in Zambia, right around this water and the river and the falls that are there. And partly the waterlogged aspect of the wood made it be able to be preserved, so they were able to study it and to date it and to look at information about it. But they found things with respect to wood and use of wood in places in Europe and in China and Africa and in Israel, hundreds of thousands of years old. It isn't just in one place, but as you start to think about it, you start to realize that human beings and human ancestors have been around for a long period of time, and there are a lot of things that have been contributed all around the world, in particular in Africa. So as we look at this particular wooden structure they're talking about, as I mentioned, they're talking about the Colombo Falls, and this Colombo Falls is right there in the southern part of Africa in Zambia, right on that border. And they talk about how they found it because the river and the area with which it was found was kind of waterlogged. The wood was shaped in a way that that it was human beings that shaped this. These weren't natural formations of wood, if you will. And given the fact that it was buried in a way right beneath or right around the area where it was waterlogged and preserved, they were able to find a lot more information about these particular artifacts than maybe you would think they might be able to find. And it becomes amazing and significant because you just never know what will come up when you look for it. When you stop, with the bias and you erase the bias and you just look and see where the facts lead you, you start to say, wow, a lot of things were happening in human history. So this particular study looked at, and I'll kind of give you some information here because you can kind of look at it. They looked at various shapes and various pieces of wood, and you can see some of that right there. Or you can see certain pieces of wood that are very old, that are clearly used for either digging utensils or shaped in a way that these are obviously things that were done on purpose. These are obviously shapes that were put into the wood that were done on purpose. And here you have people and human ancestors using wood, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Stop and think for a second. If they're using wood, and it's believed that they may have used certain wooden structures to maybe elevate themselves. This was right along the water. Perhaps this was an area that was more inundated with water than at other times, and maybe they needed platforms. Maybe they needed platforms upon which to make tools, or platforms upon which to walk or to live. And you stop to think about it for a second. That's pretty smart. If you start to take your environment around you, the wood around you, the tools around you, you start to use them hundreds of thousands of years ago. What else are you doing? What else are you doing that we don't even know? What else are you doing? And that just boggles the mind and really makes you think archaeologically what's happening and what's happening in places in Africa that we just never even think about and we never even talk about. And they go on further and it's hard to talk about and to give you some idea of the shape of the wood and how it was one long notch that fit into another notch that was clearly a part of a structure. It's clearly a man-made structure that was there. And obviously they don't have the whole entire structure, but clearly it was something that was used, and they were able to date it using luminescence. And this is clearly a part of a structure that was made by human beings and human ancestors. And it's some 476,000 years ago. So as we start to think about it and we stop and think about it, it really makes you kind of shake your head and just wonder in terms of, as we look about many things that came out of Africa, we have this narrative that's there from a historical standpoint that somebody gave Africa something. Nobody gave Africa many of the things that people are talking about. Nobody gave Africa agriculture. Nobody gave Africa ironworking. Nobody gave Africa music or language or many in writing. Nobody gave Africa these things. These things developed in Africa naturally, and people want to bring them from outside or say something, Egypt wasn't an African society, or, if somebody taught Africans how to do iron working, these things are kind of ridiculous. As we start to look at evidence, we start to see that people all over the world, including Africans, were doing things many, many thousands of years ago, so long in antiquity that it's hard for us to even put our brains around it. I mean, we look at history, and we just like to look at history from the standpoint of maybe 1 or 2,000 years from like Greece on. Whenever we talk about mathematics, we'll talk about Pythagoras, we'll talk about various people, we talk about Greeks, and that's it. When we talk about atoms, and we talk about structure, when we talk about many different things, architecture, we started with the Greeks and the Romans as if nothing happened before them. We don't even mention people really in Mesopotamia. We very rarely mention those societies, and then we just act as if nothing was happening in Africa. But when you really look at it, hundreds of thousands of years ago, 300,000 years ago, 476,000 years ago, there are things going on in Africa that boggle the mind, that go back so far that perhaps we've missed a lot that's taking place under that large sand or ocean of sand, if you will, that is the Sahara Desert now, or many of the things that have changed ecologically in Africa that we may not even know about. There are many things going on the continent of Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago that we got to give them credit for. And as I start to think about this, and I pray, put your comments down below. God bless you. Thank you, Jackie Johnson. There is that is absolutely true. Thank you for that. As I start to think about it and put my head around it and kind of just wrap my head around it, I was thinking about and doing some research and reading around ironwork, and we'll probably talk more about it. But I want to talk about it just briefly right now because many people talk about the ability to take iron ore, which can be found abundantly in some rocks in various places around the world, in particular in Africa and in the Middle East and various places around the world. You'll find iron ore. And being able to take that iron ore that's in the iron and process it in a certain way so that you can get irons. You get usable iron that will give you much stronger tools, much stronger weapons, help you with agriculture, help you with a lot of different things. And for so many years, I've heard people say, that iron working must have started in Mesopotamia and some kind of way. It's no way in the world that Homo sapiens, human beings like you and I, could have developed that thing on their own, those abilities on their own in Africa. They must have gotten it from somebody far away who came down to Africa, way down to Southern Africa, and told them how to do it, and it was passed along, and then it went away. People say things like that, but when you look at the evidence is true that people develop the ability to do ironworking all over the world, independently in various places, and you start to think about how could that even happen, and the fact that we don't even think logically about it. I was reading one thing today that was just it was just racist. It was just ridiculous, basically saying this could not have happened in Africa. This was something that was written back in the 1930s, but these are the people who were the archaeologists and the people who were pushing the science at the time, and they were pushing very racist and biased things when it came to Africa, and particularly in this particular article talking about ironworking. But start to think about it. Some of the most precious and finest pieces of ceramics and pottery that you find, and archaeologists say that apparently across the board, many of them say you can find it in Nubia. You find it in Nubia and Kerma, in the ancient site of Kerma, up there in what is today the modern day Sudan. And when you think about making ceramics, which is an old technology that people have been doing for many, many years, you think about people making ceramics, you're literally taking clay from the earth, and you're taking that clay and you're fashioning it, and under fire you're applying some heat to it, and you're fashioning it in a way so you can have all types of uses for your pottery, whether you're storing milk or beers they made from barley or water, all the many things you need to store in the day and need to store today. When you do that, you would come across all different types of things that are embedded in rock. And that whole idea that iron ore, which is something that Black people did and that they use and that they develop on their own with nobody telling them, and other people did too, is something you would naturally come across. And you start to think about the whole process of taking iron ore out of a rock and digging for it, making charcoal. In many instances, you had to make charcoal for this. As you start to make charcoal, you may come with some type of hard wood, and you're burning that wood and you're covering up and you're treating in such a way so that it turns into charcoal, so that you can heat the iron ore to the right temperatures so that it can actually produce iron. And you have to make iron be within a specific temperature range. You can't have it be too hot or it's not going to be usable. And you can't have it be too cold or you're not going to be able to get it to be, malleable enough so that you can form it in the way that you need to form it. So it becomes a tricky process to be able to work with iron and to develop iron on your own. Yet when you go back some 1800 years BC, 1800 years before Christ, there about that time in Africa, in Chad, and in the central parts of Africa, then as you kind of going out west to Mali and various places in southern Africa, you see them working on iron ore. You see them working iron and smelting iron. And you may even see it earlier than that. You see it at the same time you see it developing when it's supposed to have developed in what is the Middle East or Mesopotamia. It was already developing in Africa as well. It wasn't that somebody came and told Africans about it. And I believe that there's a very high likelihood that people all over the world, as best they could, were probably doing this early on. We just haven't found the evidence yet. The likelihood that people who were dealing with nature and already dealing with fire and already dealing with ceramics were not also at some point in time working with some type of metal as well, because they had to do with copper, they had to do with various things. I believe it could be possibly older than that, but nobody brought ironworking to Africa. Nobody brought these wooden structures and dealing with structures. Nobody brought mathematics and observing of the astronomy, whether you want to look at the Ashango artifact, the Ashangobong or Naphtha. Many of these things came directly from Africa, and we got to give them credit for that and recognize that and tell our children that. So I'll take a look in case there's any comments down below. I thank you so much for your contribution to talk about this. If you find things and articles that you know about, things you want to share, let me know. Let's have this conversation. Let's get this information out there so that we can share with our children that many of the things that they talk about with respect to Africa and with respect to many parts of history are just limited. And they don't talk about the breadth of things that they find and the breadth of things that are available in Africa that we should be teaching everyone. So I thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Please put your comments down below. And thank you very much for listening. Talk to you soon.